I'm Karoliina Lehtinen from the University of Liverpool, and I will be presenting some joint work with Udi Böker, Dunni Kuperberg and Michał Szewczak. This work is on the succinctness of alternating parity good for games automata. Now, when we are interested in the relative succinctness of different automata models, so when we work with automata, we have to decide what kind of automata we want to use, and to do that we need to look at the trade-offs between different models. So for example, deterministic automata are easy to manipulate, easy to complement, however they tend to be quite large. At the other extreme we have alternating automata, which are very compact. They can be double exponentially more succinct than any equivalent deterministic automata, but the cost is that they are more difficult to manipulate and to use in algorithms. Now, in this talk we consider alternating parity good for games automata. In a nutshell, good for games automata are automata that have many of the nice properties of deterministic automata and can be often used instead of deterministic automata, but which are not actually deterministic. So they do have non-deterministic choices, they can also have universal choices, but they retain some of the nice properties of deterministic automata. Here we talk about alternating good for games automata. Alternating automata have, in addition to non-deterministic choices, they allow for universal choices. This makes them a good model for representing logics, for example linear temporal logic or the linear time mu calculus, because in logics we usually have both disjunctions and conjunctions. Disjunctions, when we turn formulas into automata, turn into non-deterministic choices, and conjunctions turn into universal choices. So both LTL and the modal mu calculus can be turned into alternating automata without any size increase, while if you want to go from an LTL formula into a deterministic automaton, you have a double exponential size increase. So alternating automata allow for very succinct representations of languages, while good for games automata allow for good algorithmic properties. So in this talk we study how these two things combine, so how combining alternations and good for gameness affects the succinctness of automata representations. We show that good for games alternating parity automata are exponentially more succinct than non-deterministic parity automata or indeed universal parity automata. We show that this succinctness gap is strict, namely we present an exponential determinization procedure which takes a good for games alternating automaton and turns it into an equivalent deterministic parity automaton with the same parity index, so the same acceptance condition. We then use this exponential determinization procedure as a basis for an ExPTIME algorithm to decide whether an alternating automaton is good for games. That matches the best known algorithms for deciding whether a non-deterministic automaton is good for games. In this talk I will focus on this exponential determinization procedure, as it is the core contribution of our paper, and also it is the basis of our algorithm for recognizing good for gameness in alternating parity automata. The lower bound, on the other hand, is a fairly simple extension of an existing result due to Kuperberg and Szewczak, so I will not spend time on that in this talk, but you are of course invited to go and have a look at it in the paper. However, before we get to there, let me tell you a little bit about what good for games automata are, what they are good for. To give you a little bit of motivation, I'll show you a game that is easier to solve using Good for Games automata than arbitrary automata. Consider the following two-player game. We have one player representing an environment that is potentially hostile, and one player representing the system. The environment will give some input letters to the system, and the system will respond with some output letters. This way, our two players will alternate input and output letters to form an infinite behavior, the global behavior of the system within its environment. We then say that the system wins this game if this global behavior, represented by this infinite word, satisfies a specification. So we have a specification that gives us our winning condition. For example, we could imagine that the environment is filing in some requests for resources with the system, and the job of the system is to allocate resources in a way that satisfies some fairness or liveness conditions as expressed by the specification. Then a winning strategy for the system gives us a controller that guarantees that whatever the environment does, the system will behave in a way that guarantees that the specification is correct. Now, to solve these games and get these winning strategies, the traditional way of doing things is to first find a deterministic automaton that recognizes the language describing the winning condition. We then use this deterministic automaton to reduce solving this game to solving a parity game, and then we can solve that parity game using your favorite parity game algorithm. Hensinger and Peterman showed in 2006 that instead of using a deterministic automaton, we can do the same reduction with what they called a good for games automaton. So that's a motivation for good for games automata. They can be used instead of deterministic automata, thus avoiding determinization, but they can also be more succinct than deterministic automata. So for instance, Kuperberg and Chipchak showed in 2015 that non-deterministic good for games Kobuchi automata can be exponentially more succinct than any equivalent deterministic automata. Now in this paper we show that alternating good for games automata can also be exponentially more succinct than any equivalent non-deterministic or universal or indeed deterministic automaton. So in this paper we extend this by now classic result of Kuperberg and Chipchak to also applied for to alternating automata between alternating and non-deterministic automata. So good for games automata can give us succinctness in our representations of regular languages. Now I've talked about what good for games automata are good for, so it is probably time to actually tell you what they are and how to define them. So good for games automata are also known as history deterministic automata because they do allow for non-deterministic choices, but these non-deterministic choices have to be resolvable with respect to the history of the word and the run so far. So for example, here we have an automaton that accepts words in which two consecutive A's occur. But here, this non-deterministic choice depends on whether the next letter, in addition to the current letter, is an A. If the next letter is also an A, we should go to the right. If the current A is not the first of a pair of consecutive A's, then we should remain in the present state. So this kind of non-determinism is not good for games because resolving it depends on what the future of the word is. To define it more precisely, we can use the following game. So here is a game that the player Eve wins whenever an automaton is good for games, whenever a non-deterministic automaton is good for games. So in this game we have Adam and Eve playing against each other, and at each turn Adam will pick a letter. And at each turn, once Adam has picked a letter, Eve will pick a transition of the automata among that letter and move move a token in the automaton forwards along this transition. So in the limit, Adam will build an infinite word, and Eve will build a sequence of transitions over that word. Then, for Eve to win, either the word built by Adam has to not be in the language of the automaton, or the run that Eve built should be an accepting run of the automaton. In other words, Adam is committed to building a word that is in the language of the automaton, and Eve just has to build an accepting run on the fly without knowing what the future of the word will be. And this characterizes good for gameness. So if Eve wins this game, then we can say that the automaton is good for games, and we can use it for solving games or other applications of good for games automata. Now, of course, in this talk we want to consider good for gameness of alternating automata and not just non-deterministic automata. Alternating automata are automata where we have both non-deterministic choices, which I here represent by these circles, but also universal choices, which I here represent by these squares. Here we have accepting states represented by these double lines, and rejecting states represented by a single circle. So the upper part of the automaton recognizes the language of words in which response always eventually appears. Then the initial state of this whole automaton consists of a non-deterministic choice of either going up into this automaton that recognizes words in which response occurs infinitely often, or going down into this state which accepts words where only idle occurs. And there's also a non-deterministic choice to wait here. So how do we proceed the acceptance of an alternating automaton is as follows. So in non-deterministic automata, it is enough for there to exist one accepting run over the input word, for the word to be accepted. In a universal automaton, every run over the word has to be accepted. In an alternating automata, where we have both non-deterministic and universal choices, acceptance comes from a game between a non-deterministic player, which tries to force the word to be accepted by resolving the non-deterministic choices, and between a player that controls the universal choices, who is trying to get the word to be rejected. So this automaton recognizes the language of words in which either eventually neither request nor response occurs, or infinitely many responses occur. In other words, it is the language of words where if infinitely many requests occur, then also infinitely many responses occur, and is captured by this alternating automaton. Okay. Now, to define good for gameness for alternating automaton, we want to consider both good for gameness in the non-deterministic choices and the universal choices. So we will define good for gameness of alternating automata using two games that generalize the previous game for non-deterministic automata. So we say that the non-determinism in an alternating automaton is good for games if Eve wins the following game. Again, Adam picks a letter at every turn, and then Eve and Adam together resolve the non-determinism and universality. So Eve will control the non-determinism and try to force the path to be an accepting path in the automaton, while Adam resolves the universality while trying to make the path rejecting. So instead of just Eve resolving non-determinism, we also had to resolve universality, and we'll give that choice to Adam. So this is a way of generalizing the previous definition we had for good for gameness in non-deterministic automata to good for gameness of non-determinism in alternating automata. We just add this line that allows Adam to resolve universality. Then we say that Eve wins this game, again, if either Adam failed to build a word in the language of the automaton, or if the path that Adam and Eve built together through the automaton is accepted. And if Eve wins this game, then we say that the non-determinism in our alternating automata is good for games. However, our alternating automata also has universality. We say that the universality is good for games if Adam wins the dual game. So now in the dual game, Eve is the one to pick the letters, and she will have to pick letters that make up a word that is not in the language of the automaton. Eve picks letters, and Adam and Eve again resolve the non-determinism and universality by playing a game. And here Adam is the one who gets to make the universal choices, and Eve is the one who gets to make the non-deterministic choices. This way, in the limit, Eve has built an infinite word, and they have together built a path through the automaton. And this time Adam wins if either the word is in the language of the automaton, so if Eve failed to give a word outside of the language of the automaton, or if the path that they built is rejected. Okay. And we say that our alternating automaton has its universality is good for games if Adam wins this game. Now we say that an alternating automaton is good for games if both its non-determinism and its universality are good for games. So we want Eve to win the letter game where Adam gives the letters, and we want Adam to win the letter game where Eve picks the letters. And this tells us that if a word is in the language of the automaton, we can build an accepting run without knowledge of the future, and if it is not in the language of the automaton, we can build a rejecting run without knowledge of the future of the word. Again, good for games alternating automata have the same lovely properties of deterministic automata as good for games non-deterministic automata. Namely, if you want to solve games with a winning condition given by a good for games alternating automata, then this is quasi-polynomial rather than double exponential as it would be for an arbitrary alternating automaton. Furthermore, even half good for gameness can be useful, namely checking that all executions of a system satisfy a language described by an alternating automata where the non-determinism is good for games is also quasi-polynomial rather than exponential in the general case. Okay, now we know what alternating good for games automata are. I will now show you how to determinise an alternating good for games automaton. The first step of our exponential determinisation procedure is an exponential alternation removal procedure which preserves the good for games status of the alternating automaton. So this is a procedure that takes an alternating parity automaton, turns it into a non-deterministic parity automaton, and the output automaton is good for games if and only if the initial automaton is good for games. Now this is based on existing alternation removal procedures, but it has to revisit them to make sure that they preserve the good for gameness status, so you have to be slightly careful in the details of this transformation. Then, once we have such an alternation removal procedure, we can use it on both an alternating parity automaton A and its dual and obtain the following two automata. First, we can remove the alternations from A and obtain an equivalent non-deterministic parity automaton. We can also complement A, which is very easy in alternating automata, and if it is good for game, then the complement will also be good for games. And then we can remove the alternations from that complement automata to obtain a non-deterministic parity automaton C that recognizes the complement language. And these two automata B and C will be good for games. Then to build our deterministic automaton, we take as state space the product of these three automata A, B and C. And then we use the good for gameness of these three automata to determinize the transitions of this product. So very roughly, we look at the good for gameness of C and the good for gameness of the non-determinism in A to get a good for game strategy to resolve the non-determinism in A, but that is positional in this product A and C. And dually we get a way of resolving the universality of A in a good for games way, using for memory this product A times B. And then we use those two strategies to determinize the transitions in this triple product. And the acceptance condition of our deterministic automata is inherited from A. So in a nutshell, by using these non-deterministic automata for the complement of the language and the language itself, we force our good for game strategies to be well behaved and not interact with each other, which allows us to use them for an exponential determinization procedure rather than the traditional double exponential one. So that is the outline of our determinization procedure. It is also the basis of our algorithm for deciding good for gameness of alternating automata in exponential time. As before, this algorithm begins by removing the alternations both from A and the complement of A, which gives us our automata B and C such that our original automaton is good for games if and only if both B and C are good for games. Now, if we knew how to decide good for gameness of non-deterministic automata in polynomial time, then we could just do that for B and C. However, we have no such polynomial algorithm for now, so we have to be slightly cleverer than that. And what we do is we consider the following game, which Eve wins if and only if both B and C are good for games. So in this game, Adam plays letters at every turn, and Eve resolves the non-determinism in both B and C. And Eve's winning condition is that one of the runs she built, so either in B or in C, should be accepting. And now Eve will win this game if and only if both B and C are good for games. If both of them are good for games, then she can use her good for games strategies to build runs in B and C, and then depending on whether the word Adam plays is accepting, one of these runs will be accepting. On the other hand, if one of B and C is not good for games, this gives a winning strategy to Adam. And this game is solvable as a parity game in quasi-polynomial time. The winning condition is a combination of two parity conditions, which just adds a few more priorities. Now, in contrast, checking whether an alternating automaton is half good for games, so checking whether, for example, the non-determinism is good for games, we have a lower bound for that, and that is p space hard, which is an interesting contrast to this algorithm. So I'll wrap things up there. We have shown an exponential succinctness result, which is tight, as we also have an exponential determinization procedure for alternating good for games automata. And we can use this determinization, parts of this determinization procedure to also recognize good for games alternating automata. In other words, good for games alternating automata give us additional succinctness when compared to non-deterministic automata, and even more so good for games non-deterministic automata, without seeming to increase the algorithmic complexity. That's all for me now. I look forward to seeing you at the Q&A, and meanwhile both me and my colleagues are reachable via email should you have any questions. Thank you very much for your attention.